Well, howdy. Welcome to the Quality Reps podcast for the Texas A&M Coaching Academy. I'm Monty Gibson, and with us again today is Michael Altoner, our PhD student resident expert, to share some ideas with our high school and junior high coaches. So, Michael, welcome again. Glad to have you.
Hey, always glad to be here. It's fun to talk shop.
Always fun to talk shop. Well, let's get right into it. You and I talked today about the gray area in strength conditioning, because this is a real conversation that I remember having when I was a junior high, high school coach, even as a college coach, visiting in that coach's offices, the gray area of what's appropriate with programming, what's appropriate with techniques and mechanics. And a lot of coaches had a lot of great points about what they wanted to do in their weight room for their athletes, but there's some gray area there because everybody has a different idea of how to apply it. So let's talk about that gray area.
Yeah, I mean, simply put, we all have different experiences. Whether we, as a coach, we were involved with sports, most likely, most of us, and different sports and different backgrounds, different eras, different times. So I think there's a lot of confusion, especially if you add in all the competitive stuff that we do with powerlifting, Olympic lifting, bodybuilding. Now there's CrossFit competition and stuff like that. So basically my point that I'm trying to get to is, like, as the eras have gone by, there's been so many different programs that have come and gone. There's a lot of exercises that have come and gone, a lot of techniques and ideas on what is the correct way to do an exercise or a lift or a program, right? So I think what ends up happening there for most of us is that there ends up being a lot of gray area. Like, there's a conversations, like you said, where who's right, who's wrong, which exercises are right, which program is the best for us, right? Do we do Olympic lifting? Do we do only Olympic lifting? Do we do powerlifting? Do we even touch heavy weights? Like, there's just so many different things out there. So we kind of get confused, and then that makes that gray area, right? It's not so black and white as this is wrong or this is right. Right. So there's a lot of shades of gray in between. It just kind of depends on, what you're trying to accomplish.
I think you're exactly right. There is so many different programs and protocols out there. Like I said, CrossFit, powerlifting, Olympic lifting, speed performance development. And you know what? Especially in the private industry, so many people are trying to sell themselves with their specialized training.
Right. There's a guru
thing to take you over the top. And that's music to a coach's ears. What's that magic bullet that's going to take us to the next level?
Right.
And that does create a lot of gray area there.
Yeah. So, everybody kind of gets confused, and we have all these debates about what's going to work and what is absolutely right and what's wrong. And it just doesn't work that way, unfortunately. Right. So you actually, in my opinion, I think it's a benefit, because that means you have a lot of options.
Sure. True. I think you're right. And I think it's important for coaches to look at it. If you have some knowledge in each one of those types of exercise programming, exercise protocols, there's some very strong components to each one of those things that are going to help your athletes along the way.
Right.
Powerlifting is very derivative of strength development. Olympic lifting is very derivative of power development. CrossFit has a great component of good muscular conditioning. There's some neat components to each one of those and some neat variables, and they're really kind of designed, if a coach looks at it, they're designed for a competition to test one variable. Powerlifting tests the variable of strength. Is there some power to that? Sure, but it's a strength development. Olympic lifting is true power development, and it tests that variable. And so there's some neat components to that when we apply it to our athletic performance. But I think it's also important to remember we're training athletes, not necessarily powerlifting athletes or Olympic athletes or CrossFit athletes. We're training junior high and high school football athletes or volleyball athletes, junior high, high school tennis athletes, junior high, high school baseball athletes. We're applying some good strength conditioning to a different athlete that these other programs are being written for. So I think as coaches, we got to look at our population first. Who are we trying to help?
Right. Yeah, and I think the number one factor, common denominator between all those programs that you talked about is that they're using strength and fitness components, right? The training modalities that we use as a measure for competition. where we're competing in a sport with many different skills, and we're using training components and modules to basically enhance our on the field competition, right? And so I think that's the major thing that we gotta realize, is that we are not making our football athletes, our volleyball athletes, our basketball athletes, lacrosse athletes, whatever. We're not trying to make them a weightlifting competitor, right? We're just using weightlifting and those different modalities to supplement our on the field skills.
Absolutely. That's well said. Well said, because our athletes, their measure of success is on the field, not necessarily the number on the bar. Because like well said, those powerlifting Olympic athletes, their measure of success is that number on the bar. And that's what they're competing for. Our measure of success is those athletes' success on the field. With that being said, obviously we want to improve in some of those parameters in the weight room, and we know that helps with their athletic development. But then I think that's where the gray area lies. Do we really load it up and be as strong as possible? Do we work on movement efficiency? Where do we do those things? And I think when you get in the coach's office, you're sitting in the coach's office or the teacher's lounge, at the break during the day, and the volleyball coach knows that she wants to get her volleyball athletes stronger so they can jump higher, and needs a good way to develop that. But is what the running backs coach applying for those running backs, does that apply the same way for those volleyball athletes? They both might, use the example of squat, they both might get better squatting. Do they both squat the same way?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, so those are the things you got to take into consideration, right? I mean, every athlete, which we've talked about before, right? Every athlete is unique, right? They're individual. So, like, I feel like we, as coaches, we want to find that one thing that we could just apply across the board, right? And that's going to give us success. And if it was that easy, man, it would be great, right? And we'd all be wonderful coaches.
Right.
But unfortunately, that's not the case, right? There's a lot of, I guess, lack of a better word, guesswork, right? Or trial and error. And so that's, again, where those gray areas come in. So I think we should just kind of stick with the squat. I have a friend of mine who's a high school coach, and he approached me not too long ago, and he basically asked me, what's the right way to squat? And then he gave me an example. He said, one of my coaches, he likes making his kids go narrow feet, toes pointed straight forward, right? But I like it to where their stance is a little bit wider and their toes are out. So who's right? Who's wrong? And then my answer was, it depends, right? It depends, because what's the purpose of you doing that? Why are you using that technique, right? Why are they using that technique? And what are you trying to get out of it? I think that's the question you really got to ask, is what are you trying to get out of it? Because, again, you may be wrong, but that doesn't mean that it's wrong in all situations, right? If you apply it differently and for different reasons or a different scenario to a different athlete, then you could be right. So I think that's where the iffiness comes in, right? So both are right, just depends on how you apply it.
Depends on how you apply it. Absolutely. And that's where the gray area comes in. And these are real conversations that coaches are having, that, hey, well, I think squat's the best way to do it. And we load up and we put it on the barbell and we go there, and another coach says, well, I just can't get my kids to do it. They're built different. And we had a great example with a couple of athletes we worked with that I can share on the screen. But I'll kind of give the analogy first that, maybe you've got your running backs coach that works with, the top running back there at the high school, and the kid's 5'8", 5'9". He's square, he's built strong, and he's really made a lot of gains over the last couple of years using barbell back squat. His leg strength, his power, his total body power, he's really embraced it, and he's gotten well, or really gotten stronger doing that, and it's showing up on the field, and so he's been successful with that back squat. And maybe that running back coach is having the same conversation in the teacher's lounge with the volleyball coach. Says, you know what, I've got a 6'10" volleyball player that she could benefit from leg strength and really jump more. If we could get this taller athlete up over the net, she could really be a force.
Yeah.
How do I apply that? Well, just squat. Well, that 5'8" stocky running back versus that 6-foot volleyball player, they both could benefit from squat, but that squat, the way that you apply it might be different for a lot of reasons. And that's where the gray area comes in. one of it could be simple biomechanics. And I'll share this slide with you so our viewers can see. Let me get my share button here. But we had this same discussion when we were working with our football team one time. Over here on the right is one of our linemen. And then over here on the left is one of our quarterbacks at the time. Two different athletes, two different kind of movement patterns that they had on the field. But these were guys built two different ways. And part of their background or their experience, one did his traditional lifting through school, squat, cleans, bench, did what was there for him to do. He was and I'm talking about our quarterback, but he was also a quarterback, also a baseball player. And so just kind of did his traditional stuff just for those sports. Our other guy was a football player, offensive, defensive lineman in school, but he also had a background in Olympic lifting. So he really was very good, came to us at the university, very good at his cleans, overhead snatch, clean and jerk. This guy could move, had great hips. And originally when we first thought about it, we was like, well, this guy has such a great background in lifting. He went to a different coach outside of his high school in his area where he grew up that had an own Olympic lifting gym, and he loved doing those lifts for the power. So he added that to what he was doing at high school. So he really made a lot of gains. Where our other guy didn't have that experience. So we were thinking, well, our guy just has this experience, and that's why he's a better squatter. Well, our quarterback could never truly get parallel in his squat. And we thought, man, he's just not trying. He's too tight. His hamstrings are immobile. And then we remembered reading a study, and then we got to looking and thinking there might be something different in his biomechanics. And we went back and looked at our guys' DEXA scans. And if you look at
I can see it right there, yeah.
You see it. In our O lineman, who was a great Olympic lifter, look at the difference in the width of his hips already, and then the angle of that pelvis versus that quarterback. His hip angle was almost straight up and down. And then if you also look at the trochanter, that femur, it's almost at a 45-degree angle here on this lineman where it's straight up and down on this quarterback. And when we looked at that, we realized, man, it's not just their background, it's their physical structure. These two guys are built different.
Yeah, he physically could not go past that point. Like you said, exactly. He has narrower hips, so he was physically feeling his leg on his hip, and it was just blocking him. And there was no amount of stretching or mobility that could really help him out.
Right. It was a physical limitation with his bone structure. And so when we go back to our analogy of our running back and our volleyball player,
right?
Man, if we could just look at their height, 5'8" and 6 foot, already there's a physical difference there. Not to say that taller athletes can't have a great squat, but that might make you start thinking about, man, these are different leverage angles, and they're moving at different ways. That I might need to apply this squat technique a little bit different way just for this athlete.
Right.
Now that volleyball player might have had the physical structure that she can get great depth or something.
Right.
But already we know that's a taller athlete. Those are going to be different leverage points. So we might have to approach our progression for teaching squat a different way.
Right. No, absolutely. That's a great visual. Unfortunately, not everybody has those DEXA scans that they can do with their athletes.
True.
But that's just something.
But at least it gives us something to think about when we run into that with one of our athletes. When we tried everything we can in our book, and we did with this quarterback. You know, we were really trying to get him to be a better squatter. We went narrow stance. We went wide stance. We tried box squats. We went front squats. And there got to a point where he got to a point in any of those squat patterns, he couldn't hinge his hips anymore, and you'd see him where his back would round, and he was doing that stuff. And we tried everything there. We thought, well, he's just tight. We tried stretching. We thought, well, his core's not strong. We worked on low back strength, abdominal strength, and it never really fixed any of that. And when we finally realized, man, that's a biomechanical pattern. And so I think it's important for coaches to know most of our athletes are going to fall in that biomechanical pattern.
Right.
They can do a normal squat pattern.
Yeah.
But you're going to run into some things that you got to evaluate and say, wait a minute, maybe what I'm teaching isn't going to be applied very well for this athlete for a lot of different variables.
Right.
The gray area.
Yeah. And so there you go. That's perfect to what I was saying earlier. Is like, so in that situation, most athletes, you guys were right with the way that you were using the mechanics and the different variations of squat. But in this instance, it was not applied correctly, right?
Absolutely, absolutely. And so a coach on there may be asking, all right, well, what's the answer, coach? How do you do that? That guy still has to get stronger. And the answer was, you're right. We still had to increase his leg strength. So what we did is one of the things we did, he had to high box squat. We still wanted to squat him, still have that axial load, still build up that core strength to hold the squat bar. But we started seeing where his breakdown occurred, and we kept him just about an inch above that. We're going to want you to squat in the box, get to that. So we know we're still loading his hip within the range of motion that he had.
Right.
Now, as it turned out, we could increase his leg strength that way. He was better at some single leg work because I think now he can move that and can open up that hip girdle. Yeah. So we used some of his single leg work. We used back foot elevated Bulgarians, single leg squats, where we could build up some of his strength. So that became his strength measure. So we knew we still needed to build his leg strength. We found the squat variation that applied to that athlete. So, yeah, and I think that answers, like your high school coach that asked you, what's appropriate, narrow foot, wide foot. You got to find what applies to your athletes, sometimes for the whole group, but even it might go down to the individuals.
No, absolutely. Yeah, and so then, I think to move forward, we got to get with the skill progressions, right?
Yes.
So the different skills that lead up to that. So I think, again, my friend, his question to me was toes in, toes out. And then I said, it depends. And I went into saying, okay, well, what are, why are you guys doing back squat? What's their experience? Have they done this before? Are you trying to load them heavy? Right. So I asked all these other questions. He didn't necessarily have all the answers for me. It was just because squat is the thing to do. That's how you get stronger. So then, going into that, basically, you want to have the appropriate skills and progress them, right? So again, I think we've talked about this a couple of videos ago, but basically starting from, maybe you're doing body weight squats, then you do goblet squats, and then you kind of progress from there on until you get to that barbell squat, because it may not be appropriate for everybody. So that kind of goes back into exercise selection and the gray area.
Right. Yeah, and you're exactly right. And I think as coaches in the weight room, we have to look at weight room movements as a skill, just like a skill that we would teach out on the field or the court. If we're teaching an athlete how to tackle or take a jump shot or set a volleyball, do those things, we know there's certain mechanic skills that have to be all put together to increase that ability. And so we break those skills down out on the court or the field, and, into the stance, into your posture, into delivery of the hips. We break all that down on the field. We've got to do that in the weight room. And so it's a skill progression. And if we stick with squat, that's a great example. We could figure it out on the way, just throw the weight up there and let's figure it out. Yeah. We realize, no, that's a skill we need to develop. Let's break it down into those elements, And so I think having a great body weight squat, then a goblet squat, a front squat, and making sure those mechanics are great there before we get to that back squat, you help your younger athletes especially really develop the skill of proper squatting mechanics that's going to benefit them later on. So I think coaches have to have a mindset of progression of skill development. Let's get good at this skill in the weight room before we truly load this movement pattern, and you'll receive much more benefits out of that.
Absolutely. Yeah, because once you get the mechanics and the skills, then everything else is going to follow. You're going to be able to build onto it.
Yeah. So, well, let's answer just kind of the direct question. Your coach was asking about, hey, toes in narrow, toes out wide. What are some good basic components? And I'm kind of leading you here because I already know the answer. But what are some good basic components? The coach is asking, okay, well, what's the answer to that? There's coaches in their coaching office asking this right now. Well, yeah, we have the same topic. One guy likes narrow, one guy likes wide. What's right? So they're going to be asking us, what's the answer?
Right. So again, I think the answer is always, it depends, right? But so in that scenario, let's take it to where, what's more correct? Well, let's go into the why. Why are you choosing to go with your toes out? Why are you choosing to go with a wider stance, or vice versa, right? They listed different things, and that's kind of where you have to go do a little bit of research, right? So the most standard and common reason that most people put their toes out and their stance a little bit wider is because of what it targets, right? So the purpose for it is to target a little bit more of the groin, so the inside of the thigh, right? Or with the toes being pointed out, it ends up opening up the hips quite a bit, right? And allows them to dump their hips back while staying a little bit more vertical. So if you have a less mobile athlete, like your quarterback, then you go a little bit wider. Hopefully, you don't have that much of a structural block. But sometimes, if it is just a simple mobility, flexibility thing, an easy fix, and you need them to squat, then you would go with the toes pointed out or the stance being a little bit wider. But if they have pretty good mobility and everything, you're really trying to target more quads, then you would bring in the stance just a little bit more. But those are just slight, small variations. Either way, they're right. Neither one is wrong, and you're still going to get great leg strength. Doesn't matter which one you choose. But the main highlighted point in my explanation there was in the hip mobility, right? So if you're going for a certain depth, if they do need a hip parallel or even go butt to grass, right, then you may need to change up the stance a little bit because that's what you're asking for, right? But I would say that before you do that, to get what you want, I think you still need to go back towards the progressions, the skill progressions, and work on the earlier problems, right? Rather than just saying, well, this is what I want, and so manipulate the exercise to get that.
Absolutely. You see, and I think you're exactly right on that. You got to evaluate why you're squatting. What are you trying to gain from those different mechanics? But then I think it's also important too, there are some good key movement components, whether you're a narrow stance, wide stance squatter, that apply all the way across all those skill progressions. Having great posture and learning how to set that up, whether you're doing a body weight squat or goblet squat or front squat, that's got to be there regardless. And that's something that I addressed with coaches early on, even in that scenario, wide stance, narrow stance. I was like, well, how do you teach them posture first? Because I think that's almost more important than anything.
Right.
And I'll find out once an athlete's pretty good at about setting that torso and being great at bracing the upper body when they squat, some of the mechanic things we're dealing with their lower body disappear. Some of that happens because they haven't set up their torso. So I think you got to identify what's key no matter what type of squat you're doing, front squat, goblet, back squat, wide, narrow, what's key? I think there's some 5 key things. You got to have great posture.
Right.
The hips have to be the prime mover. When you're squatting, the knee and the ankle have to be in line with each other, stacked up. You don't want those knees caving in or crashing out, but they have to be aligned because you're driving that pressure down through the floor.
Exactly, yeah.
Those have to be lined up. You have to squat with your whole foot. I think that some young athletes have got to learn that they're not up on the balls of their feet.
Right, they're leaning
on their heels. Yeah, because that brings up a lot of different things too. They've got to know how to put pressure through the whole foot. And then I think the other 5 key components, and this is the coaching eye, you have to see that is all in alignment, that bar is in alignment over that midfoot. And you'll find out that that's true no matter whether you're front squatting, back squatting, goblet squatting. You've got to keep that center of mass gravity right in line with that midfoot if you're looking at it from the side. And that applies no matter what squat you're doing.
Exactly.
And that helps identify some of that gray area that coaches fight with in squats. And I think they'll find those key movement components that they're teaching through their skill progressions are some of the same key movement components when they want their athletes to get in athletic position on the court.
Absolutely. That's exactly where I was going to go.
They've got great hips. They've got pressure through the whole foot. Their knees are in line over their feet to produce force in the right direction. That's teaching athleticism.
Absolutely. Yeah, there's a reason it's called the universal athletic position, right?
Absolutely. It is.
So if you, like you said, if you get the 5 main things or the main components that is going to be universal throughout all the squat patterns, all the different variations are just bells and whistles, right? They're like spinners on your car, right? So like, you need the 5 main components before you worry about all the minor details.
Absolutely. Well, that leads us into this. I think this is great because we talked about there's some gray area that we experience when we're programming teaching technique and doing all those things. And then you and I talked about a topic, what's a better way to understand all this gray area? And so we'll leave our listeners with that. So in our next episode, we'll talk about, there's a lot of gray areas. How can we understand this better so that we can help our athletes more? Well, hey, appreciate your time. I think this one was great. There's a lot of good stuff in there, and we look forward to it. And coaches, appreciate you tuning in to us. Be sure and check out the website at the Texas A&M Coaching Academy, where we've got some good CEUs and continuing education units on some of the things we just talked about. Progression for squats. Coming up, we'll have things on power cleans, bench 2, and how to help apply some good programming and get rid of some of these gray areas in your weight room to really help your athletes. Appreciate you tuning in.
Appreciate it.